It's 8:59 p.m. and it's August 24th. So basically, when I was in pharmacy school, people like the thing is, people make up stories with each other about other people getting into fights or things of that sort of nature. It does not mean that every single story that is a short story that people make up is actually true. People make up short stories about how people at school are getting into fights and things of that sort of nature. The fact of the matter is, I used to just make up stories at home with my cousin about whenever he'd come over and visit me about how people at school were getting into fights or this and that, and how just making up stories about things that were going on about school when in fact things wouldn't be like that, and no one would really be getting into a fight at school, or there wouldn't be any violence or anything of that sort of nature, or else obviously people would end up getting expelled. But the fact of the matter is, when two people are sitting down and they're just telling each other stories and they're just making up stories, it does not mean that every single story that every single person makes up is true. The fact of the matter is, when I was in school, in pharmacy school, every single day I was inside the school, law enforcement, I'm sure, was able to see every single thing, which means that those stories that I was making up with my cousin when I was in pharmacy school were complete and total fakes. They were just made up stories. Okay, nothing more than that. Okay, no one got into a fight with anyone at school. It never happened. There was no one ever brought in any weapons to school. Okay, it never happened. Okay, my cousin knew that as well. All right, I was just making up stories. He was making up stories. We were sitting there. We were bored. We were just making up stories. The reason you know that these are just stories is due to the fact that when I was at school, law enforcement was there the entire time I would be at school. So they would be able to watch over everything that was going on at school. Yes. So basically, yeah. It's they were able to, they were listening in on every single thing that everyone would be saying at school at the different times in classes, outside of class, at the entire time. Okay, it's not like they weren't there. They were there the entire time. They know for a fact. Law enforcement knows for a fact that every single thing that I made up was absolutely false in school. Okay, they know for a fact that there wasn't a single thing that I said was true. That there wasn't anyone getting into any fights at school, in pharmacy school, or else people would have gotten expelled. There was no one with any weapons at school. That never ever happened. And you know for a fact that that is true, mainly due to the fact that law enforcement were able to watch every single thing that was going on inside that school. Now, the reason I was making up stories is kind of bizarre and a little funny, and mainly due to the fact that the cousin I was making up stories with had schizophrenia. So he would make up a lot of stories that weren't true and were pretty much completely made up, due to which I guess I would get a little jealous. And I would get a little jealous and I would make up a few stories too. All right. He's getting all the stories for himself. But the reason you know that the stories I was making up were complete and total false is due to the fact that law enforcement was there at school watching over me, watching over every single thing that happened. You know this for a fact due to the fact that the law enforcement themselves confessed that when I was in at my exam hall, they would use severe amnesia drugs on me to force me to fail those exams. If they're using severe amnesia drugs on me in the exam rooms that they've confessed right now, then that means they were watching me the entire time I was in pharmacy school, which means that they knew for a fact there was no one in pharmacy school with any weapons. No one ever got into any fights, definitely not me. I was just making up stories at home with my cousin, like some people do sometimes. It does not mean that one bit of those stories is true. Every single thing I said was made up. He used to make a lot of made up stories himself. All right. Law enforcement were there in my school, in pharmacy school. They confessed that they used to force me to fail my exams in pharmacy school If someone is forcing someone to fail their exams in pharmacy school, then that means that they have to be present inside the school every single examination time, which means that even before the examination time, they have to be present there. It's not possible for them to not be there, which means that law enforcement were there the entire time I was in pharmacy school. They know for a fact I was just making up stories at home. I never got into fights with anyone at school ever. There was no one who brought in any weapons at school ever. The only thing that people did at school was take classes and study, and that was it. There was nothing else that happened at school. I used to make up stories with my cousin, and that's literally it. Obviously, no one ever gets into fights at school, or else he gets expelled. And neither did I ever get into any fights at school. Okay, I just made up stories, and that's literally all that happened. Law enforcement is what ended up happening was law enforcement went through every single thing while I was overseas. The fact of the matter is, if what the stories that law enforcement is using against me, that I was making up stories at home, if those were true, then they would have had the actual incident of those stories. Were those incidents? Never. There's no incident. So if I was making up a story about me getting into a fight at school, the only incident that law enforcement would play would be the incident that occurred one time where I was drenched in sweat. I was being abused at home. Didn't get food for days at home, and I got really, really angry one time due to people bullying me, and I knew for a fact I would go home and I wouldn't have food for days. So if those stories that law enforcement is playing and saying that these stories that Hassan just made up are true, then where's the incident? Then they would have had the incident as well, right? If they had the incident from one time in my entire life, just one time while I was being abused by my stepbrother, one time in my entire life, that one incident in my entire life, if those stories were true, what I said, and they were watching over this, then they would have had the actual incident on record, right? If they have one time in my entire life, me getting angry, one time in my entire life, it occurred on a school bus. Throughout my entire life, it was just one time, one incident ever. And they caught that for the once in my entire life. Didn't say anything about how I was being abused at home, how I didn't get food for days at home, the entire story. If I'm making up stories at home that would have been true, if they got that incident once in my entire life from my bus, if those stories that I was making up at home were true, they would have had the actual incident as well. Where are the incidents? They're not there, which means that they knew I was just making up stories and that none of those stories were true. They were just made up stories that I was just making up with a cousin who has schizophrenia. He would make up his own stories and I would make up my own. He had all the stories and I knew they were all fake. So I made a few fake stories of my own. You know for a fact those stories were false due to the fact that the one incident in my entire life when I actually got angry, law enforcement took it from when I was on the bus ever in my entire life, okay? The once in my entire life, okay? Now, the thing about it is just the fact that if the stories that I was making up with my cousin, if they were in the least bit true, law enforcement would have had the incident itself. We know this for a fact, but the only thing that law enforcement saw while I was in school was that the only thing I did was study, take classes, and that was literally all I did. If you don't believe me, you could go back and check on the records. If they have me making up stories with a cousin with schizophrenia, then obviously, then they're going to have every single incident of when I was at school. If they have that one incident when I've ever gotten angry on a bus, then they're going to have every single incident that I was, every single incident of me at school. So you could go back, check back at the records. You will find out that the only thing I did at school was take classes and study, and that was it. I was just making up stories with my cousin who had schizophrenia because he would make up a lot of stories and I had none. That's literally all that happened. Law enforcement knows this for a fact, mainly due to the fact that the incidents that I was talking about in those stories never occurred. Okay, they never ever occurred, and if they did, they would have had evidence of it, like how they had evidence of me in the bus getting angry once in my entire life, and that was only due to being abused so much at home. And I knew for a fact when I was going home that day, I wouldn't have food at home that day, and I wouldn't have food for days afterwards either. So, yes, you have an excuse right there for what happened, why it happened. Now, the fact of the matter is, yeah, I was just making up stories with my with to a cousin who had schizophrenia, and that was it. There was nothing else to it, and you know this for a fact, mainly due to the fact that if those stories were true, then they would have showed the actual incidents. If they showed the one incident I've ever gotten angry in my entire life ever, and even that was due to me being abused so much at home, and not me being abused so much at home, and literally not having enough money to scrap by, and literally my mother working at Food Line grocery store, and me knowing that there was not enough money for to even scrap by, then obviously it was due to me being abused so much, and my clothes being dirty, not going through laundry, having acid added to it, punctured holes inside of it. So that was literally why. But the stories that I made up with a cousin with schizophrenia, I was only telling him stories that due to the stories that he was telling me, and obviously I knew all his stories were made up. It was because he had schizophrenia, but I had no stories of my own, which is the only reason I made up stories. Okay. He had made up stories. He had schizophrenia, but he had made up stories. So I made up my own stories. You know for a fact those stories were completely false, mainly due to the fact that there would be absolutely no incidents of those stories to be true when going through the records from when I was at school. If they used severe amnesia drugs on me to fail my exams in school, that means that they were watching me the entire time I was in school. The only thing they saw was that I was taking classes and studying. That's it, and nothing else. So if those stories that I was making up to my cousin were true, then where are the incidents? There are no incidents. They're just fabricating right now. And you can easily prove this fabrication, mainly due to the fact that there wouldn't be any incidents. If those stories would have been true, then there would have been incidents, but there are absolutely zero incidents. Despite them finding that one time in my entire life, me being angry, there are absolutely zero incidents for the stories that they're showing that were absolutely completely made up by me to my cousin. Those are completely made up stories that I was making up to my cousin. Okay, they're completely made up. There are no incidents of those stories, despite me being watched throughout the entire time I was at school. There are absolutely no incidents of such at my school whatsoever. None whatsoever. He knew I was making those up. I was just making those up. And you know for a fact I was just making those up, mainly due to the fact that I was being watched the entire time. And I was inside my school, and that is on record. Since if those incidents were true, then they would have had evidence of those incidents. There's absolutely zero evidence of any of those incidents whatsoever, which means that the only thing that they saw me doing at school, obviously, like any school, is taking classes and studying. They're just making up things right now, and they're taking one thing and they're making it look like something totally different, when in fact, if it was true, they would have had the actual incident. Where's the incident? They don't have the incident, mainly due to the fact that they knew that I was just making up stories for my cousin, and I would there's no one gets into any fights at school unless they want to get expelled, and I was just making up stories. There are no weapons at school unless if they want to get expelled. So there's nothing of that sort of nature. I was just making up stories for my cousin. That's literally all that happened, and they used that in order to fabricate something against me, when in fact, if there was one percentage truth to those stories, then they would have shown the incidents. But the only thing you will find when you go through me going through classes in school is the only thing I did was take classes and study. But yes, The facts will, the evidence will speak for itself that that's literally all I did at school. And none of those incidents, none of those things, stories that I was making up had actual incidents to them, mainly due to the fact that we were just making up stories to each other. And law enforcement is now using those in order to fabricate false testimonies against me, pretty much.